Oh, that worked well. All right. Well, hi everybody. Thanks so much for holding with us there at the start. My name's Annah Piggott-McKellar. I'm from Brisbane in Australia. And I'm here to talk about the case of Grantham, which was a relocation that happened over 10 years ago. And before I start, I just wanted to premise this is the international relocation session, but that also does mean international time zone. So currently it's 7 a.m. in the morning for me. I'd be getting my stepson ready for school and having just woken up from a really nice sleep. And I know the same for Anne, Christine and Chloe as well. I'm talking about this case, which is widely seen as, a very successful relocation. So Grantham was relocated over 10 years ago, and through post-PhD experiences and thinking about, what happens after a relocation. This was a topic that was of real interest to me. And I actually lived about an hour and a half away from Grantham, and then got this idea that maybe it would be a really good case study to go back and talk to people and learn about their experiences. So it's really about understanding planned relocation through lived experience. And it's called 4 experiences of relocation outcomes because and sort of building on some of the conversations that we've been having today too is like, who are we talking about when we're talking about success, or whose reality and which outcomes are we actually, premising when we think about relocation? So there were these 4 really clear outcome types that emerged. So I'll talk through that. So basically I'm going to talk about the Grantham flood. So for those that don't know about the Grantham relocation, I'll go through the flood that happened, the relocation, these different experiences of outcomes, and then some reflections and key lessons. So in January 2011, the town of Grantham, which is situated an hour and a half west of Brisbane, which is in Queensland in Australia, was hit by a significant flash flood event. So this was the wettest 24-hour period, 24-month period that we've ever had in our history. So it was very saturated, prolonged rainfall events. And Grantham is a place that flooded regularly. The town was used to flooding, they were used to rebuilding, they were used to, coming together as a community. But this was a significant event. 12 lives were lost in a small community. So this was not a small loss of life. This was really significant. And over 100 homes were destroyed. And this triggered Australia's first major modern day land swap program. I say modern day because we do have experiences of relocation in our more distant, although not that distant, history. So for example, when colonial settlers came, they built in floodplains, and several Indigenous groups in different parts sort of said this is a bad idea, don't build there. Floods happened and towns relocated. But sort of since that era, this is the first sort of modern example of it happening. And also it's a really interesting case study internationally as well, and has a lot of significance, especially around its timescale, which I'll talk about. So post the flood and before, during the relocation discussions, but before it was relocation was necessarily on the table or happening, this got a significant amount of media attention. So internationally, news organisations were commenting on Grantham because of the loss of life, because of the floods were happening all across Australia, and Grantham was sort of the the community that was represented in Australia as, that most affected. We had Prince William come to visit, which for, Australians in our, royal monarch governance structure, that's very exciting for a lot of people. And then the relocation developed quite quickly after the flood. So January 10th was the flash flood. And then by December that year, they had the first homes built and the first people living in their homes there. It did take a little bit longer for other people to eventually move up, but in terms of relocation timescales, this was very, very fast. There was a rapid decision-making process. So the mayor of the town, who's since passed away, Steve Jones, he was heavily involved in the response to the flood. and also really pivotal in leading the community towards this relocation plan. There was land available close by, which allowed them to buy this land, and they really utilised this media attention that they had to get government funding and state government funding. There was the Queensland Reconstruction Authority Act was born from this, which meant that they could bypass planning procedures that usually would have taken 3 years. They were able to get them done in 4 months. So Grantham is really seen as like a very successful process, and what they did was it was actually really incredible in the time frame that they did it in. So this is an overview of the relocation and land swap program. So you can see the flooded area there, which I don't have a legend, but everything in the blue is flooded. The green part is the houses that were eligible for the land swap, and then the red is where the new land was. And you can see here this is part of Grantham as well, but this part of the community didn't actually flood. It was all along here that was worst affected. So these people were eligible for the buybacks. And they had a ballot program. It was like for land. All sort of feedback on the ballot, and the process itself was actually, it was a very transparent and effective process. Okay, so I sort of went into Grantham thinking, when we think about planned relocation, we think of this story of people living in a flood affected area. Oh wait, here we go. This is a very, very high-tech graphic, just so everybody is aware, be prepared. Okay, so we have an old Grantham. They moved to new Grantham, right? And this is what I was thinking. I was really interested to go and talk to people that have relocated, what was life like now? But what I realised was it's much more complex, and especially in a community 10 years later, a lot happens. So there was people that stayed, there was people that left because it was too traumatic. There was people that got the land swap and then they left. And there was people that have moved into New Grantham since then. So it's not this simple story. It was quite a complex dynamic. And there was also the people, and this is one group of people that I think we do often miss when we think about relocation planning, is the people that come in for the relocation process itself. So they come in to help guide the process. And it's very easy, I think, to look back and say this could have been done better, that could have been done better, because a lot of time things can be done a lot better. But I think actually sitting down and talking to the people whose responsibility it is to keep people safe and to help undertake, fair, just processes is also a really valuable insight that we can get. So this is work that it took a lot longer than originally planned, because doing fieldwork in Grantham and talking to people was hard. There's so much trauma in Grantham from what the community went through. So we did a flyer drop in letterboxes and local businesses. We went out to market stalls and had like a market stall there, and then we snowballed from there. And we did semi-structured interviews with people. So we ended up interviewing 16 people, and that included a diverse range of experiences. So these are the different experiences that I want to talk through. So first we have the resident who relocated, right? This is what we originally, or what I originally conceived would be, the majority of the people. Then we also had the resident who stayed. So we've got the newcomer, so the people that have moved in since they moved into New Grantham, and then also the project worker. So when I talk through this, I'm not talking about one specific person. It's sort of like a group of experiences that I'm trying to summarize down into these different groups and experiences. So the resident who relocated. So as I said before, the trauma that was experienced in Grantham was significant. Sorry, I'm just moving that so I can see my notes. Yeah, so the trauma of the flood for many was significant, but it also led to this really clear decision that for some people, they just wanted to move and they wanted to move quickly. So when the idea of relocation was first floated, it gave people hope in a really challenging time. They had significant material losses and the psychological trauma was really evident. So the move brought immense and immediate safety and a sense of security. But leaving was still not easy. People had to leave homes that they'd lived in for decades, family land, place attachment, and I think leaving people behind was also a really big challenge as well, because not everybody did move, which I'll talk about. And over time, many people reported these lingering psychosocial impacts from the experiences that they went through in the flood. And that's meant the community has sort of become fragmented over time. There was also practical challenges that emerged, not significant ones, but they were still there and ones people spoke about. So people weren't able to grow food very well in the new places because the land wasn't as fertile. It obviously wasn't a flood zone where land is very fertile. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through my notes. So even though, and there was also no transportation in the new site, so there was a lot of elderly people, so that meant that they, used to be able to walk down to the shops, but they couldn't hop on a bus anymore, so it became a little bit more challenging to be mobile. So even though relocation for this group was a success, from a safety perspective, there are these sort of more social and emotional outcomes. But overall, this group was very happy. So the resident who stayed. So, and there's also some quotes up there that you can read through, which sort of speak to some of these themes that I'm talking about. But there were barriers that existed for people. These were emotional, like the fast speed at which the relocation happened meant that it gave people hope, but it also meant that some people might have missed out on that sort of the cognitive ability to jump on board the process because it did move so quickly. People that owned businesses weren't able to participate because they only had residential plots in the new site. So that was one of the bigger challenges, and it was also financially untenable for some people, especially older couples who couldn't remortgage, or they might not have had insurance. And while a lot was done to try and bring these people along, it wasn't always, it didn't always work out. People who stayed also really felt this sense of community division more so than the others. One quote from somebody was that, it feels like a foreign country up there. And that was quite profound because they are only, 500 meters, a kilometer away. And they really sort of felt that really strong distance. And while some of these people didn't stay, whether it was sort of by choice, that level of, a spectrum of voluntariness was there. Was it these bigger barriers, or was it a choice to stay? I think there's a lot of ways to cut that. But that did shift over time. So there's been flooding in Grantham since then. And since then, buyback programs have come in. So a lot of those houses and people that did stay have since participated in the buyback and moved on. So I think this group really reminds us that those decisions, they're not really one-off. They evolve over time as new pressures grow and as new landscapes change. Okay, so the resident that came in afterward. Okay. So Grantham, the new Grantham is actually quite a beautiful place. When you drive through Grantham, you can see the old site. You can see how worn down the old houses are. Sort of, there's not a real sense of this being like a beautiful sort of thriving community, and that sort of doesn't necessarily exist in New Grantham either. But New Grantham's got these beautiful like landscapes. It's up on the hill. You get a beautiful breeze. So it is an attractive place for people to move to, for people to retire to. But one of the really interesting things of people that have moved in was that this social division, they really saw it as three groups. Like they're like, there's people that didn't relocate, there's people that relocated and went through this trauma, and then there's us trying to come in and be a part of this community. But they're really unable to because that trauma still exists, and really it still exists in the community. And is that me?
It is, but
Okay.
You may continue for a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Does that sound
Yeah,
okay?
perfect. But they also really mentioned this idea that community still comes together. So in floods in 2022 that have happened and that have happened since, that sort of community identity is still there, but then, you know, when times aren't as stressful, these sort of different silos within the community really exist. Yeah, and then the project worker. So the project worker was one of the more interesting experiences. People who worked on the Grantham relocation were significantly impacted by it even years later. Some of the project workers were saying that they, and this includes council workers, this includes people that came in and worked for the project on a short time or for years. And they really speak about, one, this focus of keeping the community together. So they didn't want to do a buyback, they really wanted to do a community relocation because losing a few houses in a place like Grantham has really big implications. So the goal was to keep the community together. They had a very heavy focus on community engagement. They really wanted to bring the community along for the process. They had regular town meetings. They developed a master plan. They got everyone's involvement in that. So it was a very active engagement process. But there was this significant emotional toll that was placed on project workers that were basically acting as counsellors throughout this process because the trauma was so significant. And for them, that's had really lasting impacts because there was no real trauma-informed, process going in. They were sort of thrown into the deep end on this very significant event. So yeah, the different experiences are captured there. So this idea of trade-offs across different dimensions really exists across these 4 different groups. And I'll just go quickly to this last slide. So yeah, relocation ultimately is a moment in time. Like we often think of it as, you know, building new houses and you know, doing X, Y, Z when we relocate a community, but they are evolving and shifting places and spaces, just like the places that we live are. You know, whether it's a relocated place or not, there's lots of other dynamics happening. So this idea to check in, especially when there's been a profound social change like a relocation, is really important. That long-term process of monitoring and evaluating and providing, you know, that more well-rounded social infrastructure over years, not just, you know, months after a relocation happens. Obviously, we all know that relocation is not just an infrastructural solution. And I think there's also this really important notion of time. Like Grantham is really seen as a success story because of the fast pace at which it moved, and that was important because people were literally grasping for hope. But there's also, I think, something to be said for having opportunities for people who process things at different timescales to be able to move at different speeds to really be able to capture people's needs for the relocation process. Yes, that is me. Thanks so much for listening.
We'll go into the next presentation, but if you want to, answer a question while I get this set up.
Yeah, hey.
I was just wondering, you mentioned something about it being part of a land swap program.
Yes.
If that's like, how common are those in Australia and what are
Not
they?
Did they see
common at
anything?
all.
Okay.
So often it's like buybacks is the most common managed retreat relocation type of process. This was a land swap because they had available land and because they want to keep the community together, they were able to acquire new land and do land swap, like land for land, like for like.
And that's something that they've done before in Australia, like.
No, that's sort of the first, it's sort of like the only one we have example of that in Australia. They are currently in northern New South Wales, there's hundreds of houses that have participated in a buyback and they were trying to replicate this model on a much larger scale, but it's been really challenging to acquire land and have it ready to build on on a time scale that's able to have sewage lined up and have roads and houses built and everything.
It's really cool, thank you.
Is this yours? And Christine, very good. We're going to get this up. First, I have to try to share. I don't know where I'm doing this again. Is it right here? Here, I'll let you do it because you're the expert.
Share.
And you're looking at this one here.
I'm just gonna do,
Whole desktop.
and then it was On this one right here?
Yeah. It's this one, Doc.
I think you actually shared. No.
It's doing the desktop, but that's. Is it doing it? Well, we apologize to our participants online for the technical glitch, but I hope we are rectifying it now.
There you go.
And Christine, take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to present one of our joint papers. Anna, who just presented, is also a co-author, as well as Eliana Koro and Robert Oakes. And this paper looks into the well-being outcomes of partial climate-related partial relocations in Fiji. And I kind of skip maybe the definition a little bit, so I'm gonna touch upon it real quick. For those of you who do not know it, so it's a planned process where persons or groups are supported to move away from their homes. And the idea is to kind of be supported along the whole process. This can be done by an external authority, but it can also happen autonomously by the community itself. It often occurs within national borders, and the idea is to move people away from risk. In the case of partial relocations, as the name says, it's not the whole community that is relocating, but just parts of the community. Since in this paper, we're really looking into the outcomes of partial climate-related relocations, I think it would be helpful to also look a little bit at the history of relocations. So they have been happening for quite some time, since the late 18th century. And the reasons were mainly due to developments, like the one that you can see on the right, the Three Gorge Dam, as well as post-war. It also unfortunately happened during colonial times or post-colonial times. And unfortunately, there were many problems associated with these kind of relocations. So the problems were in the past, but unfortunately, we still see many problems today. For example, a lack of participation and consent, an inadequate amount of support, as well as many losses and damages that people are experiencing, such as social and cultural disruptions. For those of you who are interested in these kind of tensions around planned relocation, we wrote a little commentary which touches upon 3 different tensions when it comes to climate-related planned relocations. So we have tensions around conceptualizations of risk and habitability. We have tensions around community consultation and ownership, and tensions around frameworks and fundings. And I think we had many sessions about this today. Here a little overview of planned relocation cases, specifically climate related, done by Erica, who's also in the room, and Sanjula. And what is interesting to see is that you see lots of hotspots, like in the US, but also in the Pacific, but you also see a few blind spots. And for us, it would also be interesting to kind of find out if this is reflecting reality or if this has more to do with the methodology that was being used. But as I said, the Pacific is kind of a hotspot when it comes to climate-related planned relocations. And as I said at the beginning, our paper looks into the well-being outcomes of 2 relocations in Fiji. And we picked Fiji because it is at the forefront of climate-related planned relocations, which are mainly driven by sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surges, and flooding. To date, there have been roughly 6 communities that have already been relocated, and according to an assessment, around 42 are needing potential relocation within the next 5 to 10 years. And at the same time, Fiji has done quite a great job at establishing national policy frameworks, guidelines, and even a dedicated relocation trust fund. So before diving into our work, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what Anna again found in her work when it comes to reviewing climate-related planned relocations, because unfortunately her work kind of showed that most of the time the outcomes are quite negative, especially when it comes to human, financial, social, natural, and cultural elements of the planned relocation process, while when it comes to more physical aspects like housing, the outcomes are more neutral or more positive. So there is lots of room for improvement when it comes to climate-related planned relocations. So now a little bit about our two case studies. We had the chance to work with communities in Dannemanu and in Wendawa. And you can see them displayed here on this little map. So we have Dannemanu, which is a super small community on quite a remote island, I would say. And here the partial relocation took place in 2013 after this community was hit by Cyclone Evan, and it caused a storm surge and coastal erosion, and 19 houses were destroyed. So the government came in and supported the planned relocation process of those 19 houses or households that were affected by the cyclone. And that's a little picture of the community. Wendawa is a community that is currently self-supporting their relocation. So the other one happened a while ago and this one is currently happening. Unfortunately, they're not getting any support by the government, and they're also a coastal community, so highly exposed to storm surges as well as coastal erosion. And this is a picture of the old sites at Wendawa. I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the method that we use, because it's not a method that is widely used in research yet, but it really matches the context in Fiji because it aligns with the storytelling tradition of SITS. This method is called Q method. And what you try to do with this method is generate shared subjective understandings, which we then call narratives, about a certain topic. And for us, it was this topic of well-being outcomes of planned relocation that we tried to analyze. And there are 4 steps that you kind of have to take. The most important one is probably the collection and sampling of statements, because you have to pick some statements that you show to participants, and then they try to rank these statements. Of course, you have to find people who are willing and interested to do this. Then you have this actual Q sorting process, and then in the end, you can run some fancy data analyses. So as I said, the most important part is actually the collection and sampling of statements. So we were interested in well-being outcomes, and we understand well-being as being composed of multiple dimensions. So there is, for example, a framework by Singh et al., who says that there needs to be some aspects of material fulfilled, some subjective aspects that need to be fulfilled, as well as relational. And we also took a eudaimonic understanding of well-being, which focuses more on this long-term self-realization and value-based living, and not short-term desire. And we added to those 3 dimensions by Singh by adding 3 more. So in the end, we had 6 dimensions, which were made up of 3 sub-themes, and each sub-theme was composed of 2 statements. So in the end, we had 36 statements which try to cover all of these dimensions of well-being. And since this is super small, I'm just going to quickly read the 6 main dimensions. So we have aspects of environmental health included. We have physical health, material, social, place, and self. And if you're interested, I'm going to show a QR code at the end of this paper, so you can go through all of these statements if you're interested in it. So what we did was actually print out those statements on laminated cards, and we also had like a little grid which looks like this. And participants were asked to rank these statements from strongly disagree to strongly agree. while telling us why they're ranking certain statements the way they're doing. So this is where we get the qualitative information from, and the quantitative information comes from just putting in the numbers from strongly disagree -4 to strongly agree 4. So you just put them into a program which is called CanQ, and then you run principal component analyses, and this allows you to put people with similar views and experiences into one narrative. And next, I would like to quickly touch upon the narratives that we found in each of the community. And what is probably the biggest finding is that those narratives are highly split along this planned relocation experience. So we have narratives that are solely composed of people in the new site, and other narratives which are only composed of people from the old site. So this is not us putting those people into these groups on old and new sites, but Q method telling us that planned relocation is one of the main determining factors of different experiences of this whole situation and well-being outcomes. So the first narrative in Wendawa, where people are currently self-supporting their relocation, is just people from the old sites. And we kind of titled this narrative Exposed, Worried, and Wanting to Relocate. So these are people that are highly exposed. Almost every year their community gets flooded. They're really worried about the current situation, but also the future situation of their children. And most of them would like to relocate, but actually most of them do not have the financial means to do it. In narrative 2, we titled this Relocated and Safe, yet concerned for those at the old sites. So these are just people currently living in the new sites. They're not exposed to like storm surges anymore because they're a little bit up the hill. But at the same time, they're feeling this guilt of being safe while the rest of the community that they're really connected to are not safe and are still suffering from climatic extremes. When we go to Denomanu, where the relocation happened around 10 years ago and was led by the government, we again have 2 narratives that are split into people from the old and the new sites, and 2 narratives that are kind of mixed. And the first narrative we titled Strong Cultural Traditions and Livelihoods Amidst High Climatic Exposure. And these are again just people from the old site. And what this shows is that despite being exposed to climatic exposure, they still feel kind of resilient, and they still feel this connection to land and livelihoods. So when you stay, this does not necessarily mean that you're not resilient. It can also mean the opposite. In narrative 2, which we called Higher Overall Wellbeing Despite Preferring the Weather at the Old Site, this one is only made up of people from the new site, and overall they were quite happy that they had a high well-being, but they were still missing certain pieces about their lives in the old community, like the weather. And for us as externals, this might be a little bit weird because they were just relocated like 200, 300 meters away, so the weather must be the same. But it's actually perceived very differently. So they say in the old site, it's not as hot and there's a nicer breeze. When it comes to the other 2 narratives in Denomanu, as I said, those are mixed. So we have people from the new and from the old sites, and they're a little bit more negative than the previous 2. So narrative 3, we called Disrupted Sense of Community, Land, and Traditions. So these are the people who actually said that the planned relocation process actually had quite a negative impact on their kind of sense of community, land, and traditions. And interestingly, all the people who belong to the narrative are males. So we also have to account for socio-demographic factors when looking at these narratives. Narrative 4 is another interesting one. So it's a mix of people from the old and the new site, and we titled it Feelings of Safety, but Tensions Around the Relocation Process. So these people did not perceive the whole plant relocation process as fair. So there were some aspects where there were tensions. For example, they sometimes had the feeling that not everyone was involved in the discussions. So those people were actually saying, okay, there were some tensions and a few things could have been happening in a better way. And this brings me to my conclusions. So I hope I was able to show that especially partial relocations can have some positive impacts. So not everything is negative in this space. And these positive outcomes can be for those people who relocated, as well as those who stayed behind, if it was kind of a choice of them to stay behind. Another important aspect is this short distance relocation. So it was just a few hundred meters that people were relocated away. So this might be another contributing factor for those more positive outcomes. And at the same time, our research also shows that partial relocations really strongly shape the lives of people, because we saw those narratives which were really split between those people at the old and at the new sites. And I think we all know this, but I'm just going to emphasize it again, that plant relocations should be associated with agency and of course community involvement to be perceived as fair and then have more positive outcomes. So if you're currently looking for some research to do, we have some ideas on what this could be. So more research on community-led relocations and what the role of states should be in this whole process. Then of course monitoring outcomes of plant relocation like Anna did, so have kind of an assessment before, during, and after the relocation, maybe 1, 5, or 10 years after. And this is also a smooth transition to Chloe's work. There needs to be more research on climate-related plant relocations in Europe. This is currently a huge taboo topic and everyone is kind of scared to touch it, especially policymakers. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space. And with that, thanks so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Let's see if we can do this properly. Okay. Which one is yours? It's right under here, right?
I think so. Is that one?
Okay. So let's see if I just show it, whether it continues to show. Could someone online indicate if they see this presentation showing up on their screen?
It's there.
You're seeing it?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Take it away.
Thank you. So Anne-Christine took my transition line there. I saw that on the bottom of your slide and I was like, great. But yeah, very nice to be here today. My name is Chloe. This is research coming from my master's in environmental policy. I actually pitched this research idea in a summer school where Anne-Christine was, so now she gets to see the full end of it. And I'm going to be presenting on a couple case studies that I looked at of plant relocation in Europe, very much from an environmental justice lens. Before I get into it, I just want to thank Dr. Jola Ajibade and Dr. Caroline Zitgraf, because they really helped bring this project together and helped me co-author the paper, which is now available as a preprint. So a little bit of contextualization. So I'm from Belgium. In 2021, we had really, really important floods. And I'd been interested in climate questions, but I think this was the first time that it really intersected with hazards and risks for myself. And as I dug a little bit more into it, I found out that river flooding is really one of the biggest issues in Europe, that there's more and more annual flooding risk. And I had been interested in questions of mobility before, and planned relocation had come up as a method for managing risk or living with risk. And I had been doing some reading, and I decided to kind of look around in Europe where there were sort of relocations taking place. As Anne-Christine mentioned, there isn't an enormous amount of research on it yet. To be clear, my definition of planned relocation is a little bit wider. I'm looking at what I think we would call mostly home buyouts, because there's no final destination. But the planned relocation literature felt really relevant at the time. As I was reading into the topic, I think I was asking myself questions that we've all been asking ourselves about how we do these things well and justly. And so justice kind of became a relatively central part of my project. I decided to look at 2 case studies in Europe, one in the Netherlands and one in Austria. And the question that I asked was looking at how the policy design and implementation process of relocation addresses various dimensions of justice. And I was looking at this within integration of broader flood risk management. So to quickly overview the 2 case studies, the first case study I looked at was in Austria in the Efteling Basin. In 2013, they had very important floods in the Danube, and this led to a relocation program, which had already been conceptualized, but now it's just kicked into action. About 150 households were noted as being in at-risk zones across various municipalities in this region, and they were offered a buyback package, essentially. The second case study I was looking at was in Noordwaard in the Netherlands, which was a program as part of a larger flood risk scheme called Room for the River, in which the Netherlands was trying to shift away from technical flood risk to a way of living with natural flooding patterns and, as the name suggests, giving land back to the river to allow that to happen. And so for that, essentially Noordwaard was built on a polder, which is an engineered piece of land that was covering what was a normal flooding pattern. So they were re-engineering the piece of land to restore the floodplain, but there were households there. Once again, this is about 100 households or less, and it was also a program that took place in the mid-2010s approximately. So yeah, these were the 2 case studies. I decided to compare them because they took place at similar times, both through buybacks and in very top-down mechanisms. Yeah, I thought they were interesting. So the way that I approached this was very much a theory-driven piece of work. I kept coming back to Siders and Ajibade's article in which they outlined the 6 dimensions of environmental justice: distributive, procedural, restorative, recognition, intergenerational, and ecological justice. So quite a few. My initial project looked at all 6 of these, but I'll only look at 3, and the article is only about 3 today. And the way that we evaluated this was through kind of an identification of a few criteria per justice dimension, and then applied it to these case studies through looking at documents and conducting semi-structured interviews with key informants. So interviewees with policymakers, landscape architects, community workers. Okay, so to get into the first dimension of justice, distributive justice, a quick PSA here is that I am using a very Western understanding of justice. These are 2 European case studies, so it felt appropriate, but that's just a little disclaimer on my theory. So distributive justice here, I was looking at the distribution of harms and goods, harms or benefits across a society. And the primary way that this manifested in these case studies was through the financial compensation mechanism, because that was really the way that which these policies were making that happen. In Austria, the mechanism essentially gave 80% of the house market value before the flooding as a mechanism to encourage people to move. This might seem like quite an arbitrary number. Apparently it builds upon a tradition in flood risk management in Austria, where individuals are expected to shoulder some of the costs. So 80% is an approach that had been used already in the 70s and 80s in Austria. And they were also given money for 80% of the demolition costs of their previous home. In the Netherlands, the financial compensation mechanism was of 100% of the market value of the house prior to Room for the River, so a bit more of an equal approach. If we're thinking about this in justice terms and thinking about ethics, then it's clear to us that 80% of the market value is under compensation and not enough to make sure that you have the same quality of life or home as before. When looking at distributive questions, the one thing that was considered slightly was livelihoods. In both of these zones, farming was a question, farmland was a question. And in the Dutch case study, there was special assistance for farmers. So they were the only people who were given assistance to find new homes and to find new land for their agriculture, because obviously that is land that is much harder to come by. But in both cases, non-financial considerations, social impacts, psychological impacts, community ties, etc., were very absent from the process overall. There were some attempts, but they were not prioritized and they were not really heavily included. So the second facet of justice that I looked at was procedural justice. Procedural justice having to do with the fairness, of the procedure, of the decision making. There was a whole range of criteria. This was like a very multifaceted thing to look at. Everything from whether there was a certain amount of choice in relocating, was there access to information, was there transparency in the decision-making process, was the communication of good quality, did citizens participate, et cetera, et cetera. This was a very complicated one to evaluate. I will say that in both, we ran into quite a few shortcomings. In Austria, because the relocation was occurring across multiple municipalities, information was found to be quite fragmented. It was a very top-down approach. There was not much involvement in general. And this resulted in there being a grassroots movement that was put together. The flood protection for the Eferding Basin, which is around the time that it was taking place. There was a bunch of citizens that came together that protested, that put together citizen community events like the one that I have a photo of there. And they were primarily concerned with the fact that the region had been deemed no longer suitable for hard flood risk management, so dams or dikes. And they were also concerned about the 2013 flooding and its conditions and whether it was fabricated in a way to encourage relocation. They wrote a 40-page report that was taken quite seriously by the government. A task force was put in place. But an interview that I had said that they didn't really have a real say in the policy debate. So make of that what you will. In the Netherlands, sorry, this is a bit dense. In the Netherlands, the approach was community information sessions as well, but they had what they called a kitchen table approach, which is what it says. You go to the home and you sit down at the kitchen table and you talk about it. So there was a concerted effort to be a little bit more in there in terms of the process. They also had a community representative stay in Noordwaard for about 13 years across the entirety of the process, which I think helped build one of those links. One small comment on this is that in both case studies, one of the big resounding outcomes was that the communication that occurred was very technical and didn't match the emotional realities of people's feelings about relocating, which is, I think, something that we've seen across case studies, that there is this mismatch between technical flood risk sometimes and then very human sides to this question. The third dimension of justice, and then we'll ease up a little bit on this, is ecological justice. In my opinion, this is a perspective that is often overlooked, it's rarely addressed, or it's just conflated with environmental justice. But ecological justice here to me is about the harms and benefits to the non-human actors in these questions. So the flora and the fauna, the ecosystem, and more. The resounding conclusion when looking at this was the importance of property rights and property regimes. So that was the big difference between the two case studies. In Austria, even though the houses were being bought, the land remained private. So the land was not being bought up by the state, it just remained private property. And since it was a partial relocation and not everyone took up the offer, there was what some researchers call a checkerboard effect. So some empty plots of land, some homes, and no possibility for any concerted land use beyond. So there was really very little consideration at all. In the Netherlands, however, and this has to do with the nature of the project that they were putting into place, all the land was being bought back. So they could really do what they wanted in a way with the land, and as Room for the River insinuated, it was about restoring the floodplain. So there was already a sort of interest in maybe this more ecological side to the question. But moreover, they had what they called spatial quality priority. So the first priority of their project was risk reduction. The second priority was spatial quality, which is a bit of a wishy-washy term, which encompasses everything from the beauty of an area to the recreational use of an area to the ecosystem that was there. But this meant that money and attention could go into nature, and quite a few nature-based solutions were prioritized. For example, planting willows to attenuate the flood speed flow. They put in lots of large mammal grazers, yaks, etc. And the whole space became a very important biodiversity spot. And this is partially also due to the location. It's next to a national park, so maybe that was, the whole thing came together. But so this for me was a really big finding because I hadn't read much about land use and relocation, and I just found it really interesting. All right, sorry, that was a bit of quite a lot of information. And I just wanted to end on this idea of, well, why is it really useful or necessary to think about justice? Why is environmental justice a useful framework? And the question that I think was guiding me or like following me throughout this was, what if justice guides decision-making for flood risk relocation? What would that actually look like if that was, you know, a priority in an agenda? And the way that I was thinking about it was, well, this was in a way, justice could then be a compass for action. But beyond that, which I think we could all kind of agree, I like this idea of a positive interpretation of justice. So not only thinking about justice as a way of identifying where harms have occurred and where injustice has occurred and how to remove that, but also thinking about where you can introduce justice as a way to think about flourishing and transformation. And all of this, obviously, we know there are many practical constraints. We are limited by time and budgets and capacity. But for me, it was a reframing, and it made me think that justice wasn't only about doing less harm, but also about doing better. And with that, thank you so much for listening. And a little, even though I did a comparative study, a quote from one of my interviewees who reminded me that there's no recipe for any of this, and it always has to be locally based.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and that brings us to the end of the presentations, and now we can open it up for some Q&A from the audience. I'm going to try to successfully bring up the Zoom folks here, and anyone who's online as well. I see there's a chat, so I'll check. Okay, so is there are there questions? Yes, we see a hand in the back.
Yes, thank you for your interesting presentations. I'm wondering, a lot of the things that you presented are also similar to findings that we had in many of our case studies, and particularly to the first two presenters, maybe the lessons learned are very similar, as I said, and there are conceptual frameworks like classical ones like Cernier and Scudder and all these things. So my question is, are you using these, or are you trying to reinvent these, or are you building new frameworks or these conceptual things? Because these lessons learned need to be somehow kind of uplifted to a conceptual level. So what are you doing in this respect?
Yeah, for sure. So definitely drawing on, so for example, the work in Grantham draws heavily on concepts of well-being, also drawn a lot on work on livelihoods, but also, disaster-induced displacement and resettlement. But yeah, actually, if that's something you're interested in, would love to share a piece that is sort of coming out to try and actually bring a lot of these lessons that we are learning as more case studies emerge around planned relocation in the context of climate change and this need for a new framework and a new lens that does bring together all the different dimensions of experiences of relocation that are similar, but do have different dimensions to them. So yeah, that's definitely an important piece of the puzzle. But I also do think that it is really important to have, conceptually sound and theoretically strong work. That's foundational. But I also I'm a really strong advocate for needing, to really emphasize, grounded research and community experiences, as well in a topic such as, planned relocation. But I do think we're sort of getting to that point in the academic community where a lot of these lessons are coming through, and a lot of them are, similar across contexts. So yeah, no, it's so yes, draw on conceptual frameworks and histories of frameworks that exist in similar contexts, and working to create new ones. Yeah.
Maybe I can echo on what Anna has said. So we're definitely working with frameworks that already exist, but try to make them context specific. So that was the case with our well-being framework, like the super colorful kind of circle. And there was one aspect on place attachment, which of course is highly applicable to the Fijian context, which is maybe just as applicable to a European case study, but maybe not as strongly. So I think it was not our goal to come up with a new conceptual framework, but we just have to make sure that they fit the context that we're working in.
Were there narratives in the Fijian context that couldn't fit any of the well-being dimensions that you worked with? Meaning, any Western idea of what well-being means?
Could you try to rephrase that question so I understand what
So
you mean?
in what people told you, were there narratives that did not fit in either the self-reliance, long-term way of looking at well-being, or the financial sort of material, that you weren't sure where to put?
So this kind of has to do with our methodological approach. So there was not really the option for them to kind of place themselves out of the framework that we gave them, which is probably also a shortcoming of our approach. But we try to avoid this by including local stakeholders in how we designed this well-being dimension. So we had Elia there, who's from Fiji, and other people involved to make sure that our understanding of well-being matches the context that we're dealing with.
And there were iterations of because it was all translated into local language for the community QSOP approach, and there was a lot of back and forth around the translation of different words and how that applies, and that conversation around like the broader themes were there, but then actually translating that onto different words and what that might mean in the context of a relocation, and how that's framed was a really big part of that sort of iterative process of getting those different statements together. Yeah, it's a really great question.
I'll add a quick one. The idea of social capital is one question. Like even in the Australian case, it seemed like there might have been this sort of maybe reciprocity or things like that that were shattered when you moved part of the community out. And so just curious about that social capital aspect. Another thing, so when I worked with Tony Oliver Smith on some of the early work for the Science magazine piece we put together, we kind of concluded that disaster displacement and resettlement tended to have a slightly higher success rate, however measured, and you guys are going much more in depth on, Thayer Scudder and others had come up, and Cernay have come up with these different ideas of what makes for successful resettlement, but then the infrastructure resettlement. So I wonder if that finding still holds as we've been doing more climate-related resettlement, or if it's, so resettlement in association with a dike or some kind of climate mitigation project, or adaptation, infrastructure versus, a disaster, post-disaster. I'm just wondering if, the success rates by the various criteria you have still bear out in that way.
I'll say, okay, sure,
I'm proud of
I also don't
it,
wanna be
so.
like, I think it depends, I think even breaking down, I think yes, but then I also think breaking that down further is important because, it's not just the hazard or the driver.
Mhm.
There's so many other factors that are important when looking at, success of a relocation, and what that might look like and what that might be and how you can get to that point. So within, hazard related relocations, was it a disaster like in Grantham, which had, both spurred the process on and I think had more successful outcomes for some, but then didn't for others because of that trauma. And then slow onset impacts, driving climate hazards might mean people don't necessarily see the need to relocate as strongly. So then you have maybe a bit more of a tension around wanting to leave or not wanting to leave. But I think there are principles and governance principles primarily that might dictate it more strongly as well than just the broad concept of hazards leading to more successful outcomes.
Right. I think
thought.
there's one more. Oh, did you
Yeah,
want to
maybe I can
that?
add
Sure.
to this. I think it would also be super interesting to see whether we get the same results that we did in the same community, but just using a different methodological approach to just kind of see what kind of biases are we adding with our choice of methods to communities and planned relocation outcomes. So if anyone has time, do that.
There's one
Yeah,
more question here.
I had a question, and I don't know if I can put it in the right way, but I was really impressed that everywhere in geography and in Australia, Austria, and then also in Fiji, are studying about relocation. And then I think there are many people here in the US are studying about relocation, managed retreat, and also in Asia, we study relocation as well. And when it comes to the academic sharing or built on the theories, where do you think we refer a lot? I feel that even though, as we know, we say that the relocation is very local decisions, and it really has variations. But I think as a scholar, I think we try to put into one of the big, theory or theme or the methodology that we want to frame it in a certain way. And do you think we are sharing it enough? And which part of the theories or the readings do we rely on? So I'm just curious, and I wonder which part of from Australia, which papers do you read the most, and where do you build your research on? And from Europe, where do you rely on, and in Fiji when you do work?
That is a super good question, and I have been thinking about this a lot today. And because it's not just different concepts that we use in different regions, but even terminologies. Because planned relocation to me might be something completely different to you or to anyone else in the room. And I come from Germany, and there's like almost nothing happening in Germany on like plant relocation. And we don't even have like a real established German word for it. So I'm like, how are you supposed to research something if there's not even an established word
Right.
of this whole thing? So it's even lower than concepts, it's just terminologies that we're dealing with that might be completely different depending on your discipline and your geographic location that you're working on.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because when I had started and I was sort of trying to sift through and see if this was happening in Europe, etc. I mean, if you just type it into Google Scholar or something, not much came up. And it had in part to do with the words being used. I mean, recently I've been looking at some UK case studies and they talk about rolling back. I've not seen anywhere else talk about rolling back. And then things can just fall under the radar completely. Yeah, and I don't know what the way to get around that necessarily is. And then what I find interesting as well is that I think because sometimes we want very specific definitions of things, then there are case studies that are occurring or that are being studied from like a completely different lens and then aren't being tied back to climate mobility literature at all. So you might be doing your searches with the right keywords and whatever, not finding things, and then you actually talk to people and then they're like, no, there is these cases, but either they're only being studied from, say, I don't know, economics, or the other thing that I've found, and this is maybe even beyond, like before getting into academic literature, is that they're really unpopular things to do. And so they're not advertised and they're hard to find in the news. That's something that I have been finding. And then you actually talk to people and you realize that like behind a couple levels of government, like this is occurring or happening or being talked about. But if you're on the outsides, yeah, but that's not a very constructive answer. Sorry, that was just me pointing out more problems.
Maybe we should wrap up here, but thank you very much to